thank you for the introduction. For those who don't know me, I research and find ways to fight contemporary authoritarian propaganda, Russia, increasingly China, Iran, and also the authoritarian propaganda we see inside democracies as well. But, after having really studied the subject for 10 years now, probably, but more, certainly since 2014, really, is when I started doing it in a very, very focused way. Um, um, I came to a point of despair, essentially. Nothing that we were doing seemed to be working. You know, I knew people who tried fact checking against the lies and the disinformation. And very soon we found out that people don't really want the facts. Facts aren't interesting to many people. I know people who, and still try to educate audiences that like Putin's propaganda or like far-right propaganda, try to educate them, teach them media literacy, all these noble liberal ideals. And frankly, while these are all very good things to do, they weren't having any impact. And my background is Ukrainian. I spent a lot of my time in Ukraine, and I was there from the start of the war. And I remember going to Bucha just after it was liberated, and seeing these kind of seeing the dead bodies being gathered from the streets and packed into vans, and speaking to a Ukrainian general who had liberated the Kyiv suburbs, and we were just standing there smoking, watching the dead bodies, and he was in a state of shock for many reasons. But one of the main ones was that he'd actually studied in Russia, like a lot of the Ukrainian military elite. He'd got his education in Soviet military academies in Omsk, and ever since the start of the war in 14. He'd been calling his fellow students who are now Russian generals, and just personally just saying, like, what the hell are you doing? Why are you murdering us? What's going on? And like many Ukrainians, phoning their Russian relatives, phoning their Russian former friends. And at the other end of the line was a complete denial of reality. Either there's no war crimes happening, or if they're happening, it was necessary. Putin is right. You're making it up. This complete denial of reality. And so often I experience this. So often I give talks about my books, and I'll have someone come up to me afterwards. To authoritarian propaganda, to conspiracy theories. And they always just say, look, what do we do? Fact checking won't help. Media literacy won't help. How do we actually do something about this? And sort of in this state of despair, really, I turned to history. What can we learn from history? What examples are there from history of battling this sort of extreme propaganda, reality denying? The subject of my talk today, a man called Sefton Delmer. Sefton Delmer, largely forgotten by history, led Britain's covert propaganda against the Nazis in World War II. So throughout World War II, he ran dozens of secret radio stations, newspapers, magazines, blasting into Nazi Germany and occupied Europe. Hundreds of people worked for him. It was all based in this beautiful country house outside of England, outside of London, sorry, with paintings of Holbein and Van Eyck on the walls. And the people who worked for him were an amazing combination of people. There were many actors from the Berlin cabaret scene. Yeah, he employed a lot of theater people who'd been exiled out of Germany. The first professor of psychoanalysis at Cambridge was there. A huge amount of great novelists worked for him, spies, scholars, theater people, this incredible combination, soldiers, many, many former soldiers. The whole thing was made possible by Ian Fleming, the author of James Bond, who was very high up in naval intelligence at the time and gave them money towards this. And this was basically a huge experiment in subversive anti-authoritarian propaganda. Delmer was also coming from a point of despair. Yeah, he thought that liberal German media that was in exile, that was still trying to, communicate with people inside Germany in 1941, preaching the virtues of democracy and socialism, was a complete waste of time. He thought that the BBC German service, which was giving lectures about democracy and how evil Hitler was a complete waste of time. He basically thought that by 1941, if you hadn't convinced people in Germany that Hitler was bad and that democracy was good, you were not going to convince anybody new. It was too late to do that. And instead, what he thought is that you have to destroy the emotional connection between the leader and the population in order to essentially disrupt the war effort. Yeah. He didn't want to preach to people. He didn't want to turn them into good Democrats. He didn't want to turn them into good liberals. He just wanted to destroy that relationship so that people stopped following Nazi orders, so the soldiers would start to defect, so that citizens would not go to marches, so that people would not play their role in the Nazi economy, and so on. And there's really three things that he based his thinking on. Now, he'd lived in Germany as a child. He was actually born in Berlin, raised in Berlin, British, but essentially culturally very German. And he'd worked in Berlin as a foreign correspondent, as a journalist. And he got very close to the Nazis during their rise in the 20s and 30s. And essentially, he thought there were three principles that made authoritarian propaganda powerful. And he saw the same patterns in all authoritarian propaganda, whether it's Soviet, whether it's right-wing in democracies, whether it's the Nazis. First one, the leader allows people to articulate their nastiest selves. Yeah? We often wonder, why do leaders who are unpleasant, narcissistic, hateful, why they're popular? They're horrible, or they're ridiculous, but they're popular. And basically, Delmer understood that they were allowing ordinary people to be aggressive, narcissistic, and horrible. Yeah? They were allowing these emotions to come out. That was number one. Number two, they created a group identity. Yeah? The folk, in the case of the Nazis, but in a time of flux and a time of change, they gave people a sense of group identity. And number three, and this I think was his most deep insight, was that they gave people a role in life. Yeah? Delmer had a very theatrical view of human nature. He thought we were always performing roles in life. He would have understood social media very well, where all of us are performing ourselves and where people get into, I don't know, conspiracy groups or propaganda groups where they perform a vision of themselves. The Nazis, it's very easy. They gave you a uniform to wear, a language to use, you're an Aryan, a member of the master race, and so on. So those three elements, expressing the most violent feelings, legitimizing them, creating a group identity, and giving people roles to perform that they found satisfying. And so when he created his radios, and there were dozens of them, that's what he thought about. Now, his radios, if you tuned into them, they were nothing like the BBC or Die Zeit. They were much more like Bild meets Pornhub. Huge amount of pornography in order to get listeners in. Very, very violent. Hosted by angry German soldiers furious with corruption in Nazi Germany, using all sorts of slang, with detailed stories about how horrible life was on the front lines, on the mid-level corruption of Nazi officials. But beneath this cabaret of passion and filth, there was a logic. Firstly, Delmer wanted to break the emotional monopoly the Nazis had on violent feelings. So his radio shows were full of fury, sexual anger, in order to sort of take away the Nazis' dominance over strong feelings. He wanted to cover the Nazis with, and I'm quoting here, as much filth as they had covered the Jews. If you want, we can read some later, but it's quite intense and full of swear words, and I don't know if there are children present, and I can quote it, but if maybe we can do it later. That was number one. Number two, he gave alternative group identities. So his radio stations talked about the army as an alternative to the folk, talked about regional identities, talked about religious identities to create an alternative group identity to the Nazi idea of the folk. And perhaps most interestingly was he was trying to get people to act in another way. Yeah? This idea that we're always performing in life. He was always encouraging people to not act the role of Nazis or Nazi soldiers, but to act in their own self-interest, to think critically, but also to do things that were constantly undermining the Nazis, whether that was to play a role and get yourself, pretend to be sick and get sent home from the front, or all these clever ways he thought for people to sabotage their U-boats so they wouldn't go to sea, and so on. So he's almost getting people involved, what today would be like a social media meme, or a TikTok dance, but in order to undermine the Nazis. So what does it mean today? You know, today, as I analyze Russia, and I still do a lot of sociology into Russia, a lot of data analysis, I think it's very hard to make any kind of argument that looking at Russia or China or many other places, that people are secretly en masse yearning for a liberal democratic change. There are obviously people who are, but if you're talking about the soldiers' families, Putin's core support, people made a choice a long time ago to be part of this world. But if tomorrow, like with Delmer, we were to launch a huge media aimed at Russian soldiers, their families, the people who work in munitions factories, the lower middle class that Putin actually depends on for his power, and that Delmer was targeting in his media, we could do it so much easier than Delmer ever did. We have way more information about their lives, understanding what they hate, what their resentments are. We have way more ways of reaching them than Delmer had. Delmer just had radios. We have Telegram, satellite TV, TikTok, millions of ways of reaching them. And more than ever, it's possible to get people into an interactive relationship, create an alternative identity through online participation, much easier than it was with radios. I mean, on the last point, Delmer's radios were listened to by 40%, and by the end of the war, 50% of German soldiers. Yeah, the Nazis were apoplectic. Yeah, there's great letters from the SS saying that these radios are among the top 3 in Munich in 1943, at the height of the war. So he proved that you could reach people who seemed to be in an alternative reality. He proved that you could disrupt the relationship between the leader and the followers. To do that, you have to throw away any dreams about converting people to democracy and really focus on the emotional ties between the leader and their followers and destroy them.
On that positive note, to destroy the links between the leader and his followers or their followers, I promised you to get an opportunity to ask Peter, so I can't really see much, but I know that there are urgent questions in the room, so we're going to collect maybe 2. I already see one hand here in the darkness, and maybe Do we have a microphone coming? Yes, please here in the... Yeah, okay. Introduce yourself briefly and then a question.
Hi, Peter. Nikolai Klemenuk here, a journalist from Berlin.
Hey, Nikolai, how are you?
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I was thinking, when you described these activities, I was thinking of, people like Navalny and his foundation focusing on corruption and disrupting the elections. I was thinking of the war correspondents who are the Russian types of modern Nazis, but they criticize the regime for not being whatever, hardline enough. What's the principal difference? I see all these efforts happening right now, and all they fail like magnificently. What's the difference? Thank you.
Firstly,
Peter, maybe we collect one more question so you can.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Nikolai.
Yes.
I addressed it in the book, but yes. So that's a very good question.
Hi, Peter. Here's Andy Schenk from DPA and freelance reporting. And I have just one question to you when we're talking about the sort of effort that could be, as you said, this hypothetical of a massive launch of an informational campaign directed towards the Russian population or the general public. Do you see this sort of effort being undertaken by any sort of European or non-European country at this moment, or do you see any potential in this? Because and which nation could have probably the potential in your point of view? Because especially in my opinion, Germany is lost. Germany has lost his media campaign in 1945 when Delmer was not elected to the person to oversee the creation of the new German media, as you have very effectively put in your book. I know. So thank you.
There was. Yes, Delmer was actually very famous in Germany in the 50s and 60s. But yeah, he was, as I write about in my book, at the end, he was going to be the guy to set up what would later sort of become the German media system. But he was too radical. So it's a question of what to do and who to do it. So, Nikolai, very good question. So, without a doubt, Navalny's mix of anti-corruption and motivation echoes some of the stuff that Delmer was thinking about. The way Navalny created, very successfully, you say failed, no, he was incredibly successful. He created this idea of the party of crooks and thieves. It was very successful. It became very, very powerful. And at the end of the day, Navalny was killed because he was seen as a threat. Prigozhin as well, very similar to some of the stuff Delmer was doing. The language of the soldier, the fury of the soldier, getting the kind of lower middle class behind you against the corrupt generals, very similar. But there's a huge difference, a massive difference. When Delmer focused on corruption, he wasn't trying to create a movement against the Nazis. He wasn't trying to change anything idealistic. He wasn't interested in politics. When he talked about corruption, his aim was to increase corruption. He was saying, look, all the Nazi officials are corrupt. Why should you fight? Yeah? This was always the accusation about Navalny's ineffectiveness, as you know, that actually when Navalny was criticizing Putin for being corrupt, a lot of Russians were like, I want to be like that. But that's not what Navalny wanted. Navalny wanted to inspire a movement. Delmer had zero interest in that. He didn't want to inspire any kind of movement. Quite the opposite. He wanted people to stop functioning. So the aim was completely different, but pressing on a lot of the same buttons of resentment, anger, injustice, but then taking them to a completely different place. Yeah? But those buttons do work. That's why Prigozhin has been the most, whether we like it or not, the most effective moment of opposition since the war started. And Navalny, you say he was enough of a threat to the regime for them to decide to kill him at one point. So very similar buttons they were pressing, but with completely different aims. As in who should do it? Look, I consider democratic European countries to be in a form of warfare with Russia. Call it political warfare, call it hybrid, non-linear, whatever you want to call it. The Russians certainly think we're at war with them. But officially, we haven't adopted that policy. And until we do, you can't really start doing any of these things. You have to recognize that you're in a conflict, whether it's kinetic or non-kinetic, before a green flag goes up and governments start acting at scale. They might do little things, but at scale, you've got to make it a priority. You've got to say, constraining Putin's Russia and its allies is a generational challenge, and we will do it. That has not happened. I live in America, where, you know, the main aim is to sort of make peace with Russia and forget about it. Yeah, there is absolutely no desire to do anything. But there are countries who are in an existential fight with Russia, most notably Ukraine. Obviously, the Ukrainians are doing all sorts of psychological operations to undermine Russian troops, but Delmer wasn't doing, you know, what military calls psyops. Yeah, those are little things, very tactical. Delmer was doing cultural change. He was doing what, you know, in the Cold War would have been Radio Free Europe or Voice of America. He was doing things at scale. And I think the Ukrainians would do it. I think it's just a question of means. I mean, Ukraine has to think about its daily survival. And to do this properly takes money, resources, and ambition. So you would think it would be the frontline states, you know, Ukraine, Poland, the Balts, the countries for whom this is literally a war or a Cold War or a hot war. But I think that's the way we're going anyway, guys. I mean, I think, you know, the old actors are going to go and do something else in this world, and it's going to be up to Northeastern Europe, maybe Germany if it feels up to it, to constrain Russia, because nobody else will.
Peter, on that optimistic note, I have to realistic. No, there's a room full of fans, those who have more questions. So I really hope that we can have you in Berlin next year for the hopefully next year's Vitsche conference. So Peter Pomerantsev, a round of applause for this amazing presentation.